In July 1944, a group of German soldiers found themselves on a slow, creaking transport ship crossing the English Channel. They were exhausted, hungry, and more than anything, certain of what awaited them. Nazi propaganda had prepared them meticulously for the ordeal. Britain was painted as a place of cruelty, of relentless hatred for the German soldier. They had been told stories of barbaric treatment, of deliberate humiliation, of harsh and unyielding captivity. Every leaflet, every speech, every rumor whispered into their ears had reinforced the idea that the moment they set foot on British soil, they would be met with brutality. These men carried the weight of fear, not just for themselves, but for the honor of their comrades and the pride of the Reich. From the beginning of the war, the German military had framed surrender as the ultimate disgrace, a personal failure that could never be redeemed. To be captured in Britain, they had been told, was to be handed over to enemies who would exploit that shame, who would strip away their dignity, who would turn their weakness into spectacle. As they boarded the transport trains at the holding camps in northern France, the soldiers were tense, anticipating every step of the journey. Conversations were sparse, often interrupted by uneasy glances toward the guards. Some spoke quietly of the stories they had heard, how British guards supposedly mocked prisoners, how hunger and cold would be used as weapons, how any misstep could bring immediate punishment. These fears were reinforced not just by propaganda, but by the strict discipline of the German army itself. They had been drilled to expect the worst, to prepare for the possibility that their captors would see them not as human beings, but as enemies to be broken. Even the simple act of leaving France was suffused with dread. The train carriages were overcrowded, the air heavy with tension. Soldiers clutched their belongings, half expecting them to be confiscated as soon as they crossed into England. Every mile felt like an eternity, every pause a potential trap. Yet within that anxiety was a strange cohesion. Men whispered reassurances to one another, relying on shared memory and camaraderie to maintain composure. Their fear was collective, and it made them sharper, more alert. The journey across the channel was another test of expectation versus reality. Some had imagined British waters patrolled with hostility, torpedoed ships, and constant threat. Others had pictured a landscape scarred by war, a population eager to exact revenge. But the sea crossing was quiet. No sudden alarms, no gunfire, no shouting. The English coastline appeared not as a fortress or a field of vengeance, but as a serene stretch of cliffs and farmland, almost peaceful in its normality. This contradiction unsettled some, but most suppressed it, clinging instead to the narrative they had been fed for years. Upon arrival at the docks, the German soldiers were met by British personnel, organized, calm, and methodical. There was a natural rhythm to the unloading, a surprising absence of the cruelty they had imagined. Guards wore uniforms that were neat, disciplined, yet not menacing. Instructions were clear, practical, and impersonal. Every detail of the process seemed designed to maintain order, not to intimidate. Still, the soldiers' minds worked to bridge the gap between expectation and reality. They had been told Britain would punish, and now nothing seemed to match the story. The transfer to the prison camps deepened the tension. They were herded onto trucks and trains that took them further inland, away from the coastline and the potential chaos they had imagined. Along the way, they observed towns and villages, small farms, and quiet streets. Shops remained open. People went about ordinary lives. None of the savagery, none of the hysteria that Nazi indoctrination had promised was visible. Some soldiers tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the cruelty came later. Perhaps the British saved their harshness for selected targets. Perhaps this calm was just a prelude to the reality they dreaded. Arriving at the first British camp, the soldiers were guided through gates that were sturdy, secure, but not threatening. Barbed wire was present but not overwhelming. Guards moved efficiently, never unnecessarily close, never raising their voices. The camps themselves were surprisingly clean. Paths were swept, buildings orderly, and facilities in clear working condition. Food was distributed at regular intervals, portions adequate, even generous compared to the rations they had endured at the front. These details did not produce relief. Instead, they created cognitive dissonance, a subtle but insistent conflict between everything the soldiers had been taught and everything they saw. In the barracks, the soldiers were assigned bunks. Each man had a place, a mattress, a blanket. There were no punishments handed out for minor infractions, no displays of force to instill fear. Officers maintained rules with quiet authority rather than aggression. For the German soldiers who had been trained to equate captivity with humiliation and suffering, the ordinariness of the setting was almost worse than cruelty. It challenged their deepest assumptions about the world they had fought for and the enemies they had been told to fear. Daily routines began immediately. Prisoners were accounted for, meals served, spaces cleaned, schedules maintained. Tasks were organized with a precision that felt foreign yet undeniably competent. There was no shouting, no humiliation, no overt threats, yet within the calm was an undercurrent of tension. Soldiers instinctively watched for signs of deception or hidden danger. They scrutinized the guards' faces, analyzed gestures, and measured the pace of every order. Their minds, trained to expect malice, were on high alert, processing every small irregularity. This constant anticipation of cruelty became a subtle form of psychological strain. At night, the soldiers spoke quietly among themselves. Many recorded their impressions in letters or journals, trying to reconcile the contradictions. Some wrote of confusion, of disbelief that a country so powerful could manage captivity without overt cruelty. Others struggled to articulate the unease that came from the lack of expected hardship. It was not relief that weighed on them, but the absence of punishment itself, the paradox of normalcy in a situation that should have been extreme. Even as the first days passed, the prisoners remained on edge. There were work assignments, but they were practical rather than punitive. Gardens had to be tended, workshops maintained, simple construction carried out under supervision. Guards ensured tasks were completed, but did so without aggression or personal insult. The soldiers carried out their duties mechanically, caught between recognition that their basic needs were met and the disbelief that this could be happening at all. Each day blurred into the next, a sequence of ordinary acts set against the backdrop of what should have been an extraordinary threat. Some attempted small acts of rebellion or defiance, testing boundaries to see if cruelty would emerge. They would delay a chore, speak sharply, or ignore minor order. Often, the response was measured and consistent, but not punitive. This only deepened their sense of disorientation. Their expectations of emotional or physical retaliation were consistently unmet, eroding the framework of certainty they had carried for years. Letters sent back to Germany told a strange story. Some soldiers described cleanliness and order, food and shelter, a calm that was difficult to believe. Others omitted details, fearing that reporting any softness would be seen as weakness. Nazi censors encouraged reports of British brutality, but these accounts were increasingly impossible to fabricate. Reality, in its quiet, persistent normalcy, resisted the propaganda that had defined their understanding of captivity. By the time the prisoners had settled into the routine, the first seeds of doubt had been planted. The men had come prepared for torment, and yet what they found was structure. They had expected chaos, and yet the world around them was organized. They had anticipated punishment, and yet received neutrality. The cognitive dissonance grew, subtle but insistent, shaping thoughts and dreams, coloring interactions and perceptions. The arrival had not broken them physically. There were no chains beyond those of confinement, no abuse beyond strict regulation. But the mind works differently when it is primed for terror and met with calm. Certainty, once absolute, began to wobble. Soldiers who had believed in the inevitability of suffering now faced a deeper challenge, understanding why the enemy, who could have harmed them, chose not to. As the first weeks unfolded, observation became the prisoner's constant companion. Every detail mattered. The orderliness of the mess halls, the politeness of guards, the quiet efficiency of administration. all contradicted the narrative drilled into them. The soldiers could not openly question what they had been taught, yet their experiences demanded acknowledgement. Thought became a silent battleground. Expectation clashed with perception. Belief collided with reality. By the end of the first month, the psychological landscape was shifting. Men who had been certain of punishment and cruelty now moved through a world that made sense only in fragments. Some began to isolate themselves, withdrawing from conversation, replaying memories of propaganda against the reality they could see. Others engaged in meticulous observation, trying to identify patterns that would confirm the old narrative. Yet more often than not, they found themselves unable to locate the cruelty they expected, leaving a persistent, unspoken tension in its place. It was in these moments, walking along the orderly paths of the camp, observing quiet work crews, listening to the steady hum of daily life, that the German prisoners first realized that Britain was not the world they had been told to fear. But the full weight of this realization had not yet taken hold. The calm was not comforting. It was strange, alien, destabilizing. They had been prepared for battle, for punishment, for confrontation. Instead, they faced a silence that demanded a different kind of reckoning. And so, as the sun set over the neatly aligned barracks and the sounds of routine carried into the evening, the German prisoners sat with a question that had no easy answer. Their journey had brought them here, to Britain, and yet the war they had imagined, the cruelty they had expected, was absent. The landscape of fear they had carried for years was quietly, persistently unraveling. In that tension between expectation and reality, a new, deeper challenge began. A psychological trial that would not be measured in scars or hunger, but in understanding the limits of belief itself. At the gates of the camp, standing under the fading light, the soldiers understood that arrival was only the beginning. What came next was not suffering, but confrontation with a truth far more destabilizing, that the world they had been taught to fear was, in practice, not what they had imagined. The German prisoners stood at the gates, watching the fading light settle over orderly barracks, and for the first time, they felt uncertainty that was almost physical. Nothing had happened as expected. There was no shouting, no humiliation, no violence, only calm, only routine, only quiet order. And in that absence, their minds began to unravel. The first days inside the camp revealed details that contradicted everything they had believed about the British. Meals were served on clean trays, plentiful and warm. Bread, meat, vegetables, enough to fill them without scarcity. Water was abundant. They were allowed to wash freely. Beds were clean, blankets fresh. The facilities were simple, functional, and maintained with care. Prisoners noted these things in hushed tones, but the observations felt almost dangerous. To acknowledge them was to betray what they had been trained to think, what the Reich had insisted was the truth. The soldiers tried to find the expected cruelty in small ways. They waited for guards to shout, for orders to be exaggerated, for punishment to be arbitrary. When nothing came, anxiety grew. It was not relief. They did not feel safe. They felt disoriented. The mind, trained for fear, cannot easily accept neutrality. Certainty had been a shield, and now the absence of hostility became a subtle weapon. The calm itself was destabilizing. Daily routines reinforced this dissonance. Prisoners were assigned to work details, gardens, workshops, simple construction, and the tasks were never punitive. They were structured, precise, supervised efficiently, but without aggression. A soldier might sweep a floor under the watchful eyes of a guard who said nothing beyond what was necessary. A group might tend a garden with instructions given politely and firmly. These actions were ordinary, even mundane, yet they produced tension. The soldiers have been trained to expect that every interaction with an enemy was a test, a threat, a potential source of suffering. The ordinariness was unnerving. Letters and diaries from the period show that confusion grew steadily. One soldier wrote of the quiet that screams in your mind. Another noted the unnerving efficiency of the guards, the too precise order of the barracks. These were not euphemisms for relief. They were records of cognitive conflict. The prisoner's mental energy was consumed not by labor or hunger, but by trying to reconcile the contradiction between expectation and reality. The guards themselves contributed unintentionally to this psychological strain. They were professional, polite, and consistent. Every action was predictable. Orders were given and followed without drama. There were no surprises, no sudden shifts, no displays of power meant to intimidate. In a world built on fear and propaganda, the predictability of humane treatment was an unexpected threat. The German soldiers' minds, attuned to constant vigilance, were now tasked with a new kind of calculation: how to anticipate danger where there appeared to be none. Even the other prisoners contributed to the shock. British soldiers who had been captured in earlier conflicts, civilian internees, and local camp personnel all moved with a quiet efficiency. There was no spectacle, no posturing, no public mockery. The prisoners watched and tried to find the expected cruelty, scanning for subtle signs of manipulation or hidden malice. Each day that passed without incident added pressure. If Britain could maintain calm in captivity, then everything they had been taught about the enemy was called into question. The psychological dissonance became more pronounced during moments of rest. Soldiers would lie on their bunks, listening to the distant wind or the faint sounds of work crews, and feel an internal conflict they could not articulate. The mind expects chaos, and when faced with order, it searches for hidden meaning. They began to suspect ulterior motives in kindness. Perhaps the British were testing them. Perhaps every gesture, every ration, every polite word was a trap. The certainty of punishment had been replaced with the uncertainty of normalcy. Some attempted mental exercises to restore clarity. They compared their experiences with propaganda leaflets, with soldier stories, with the warnings of officers. Each comparison deepened the confusion. How could a nation portrayed as cruel, barbaric, and vengeful behave with such composure and respect? It was not an easy question to answer. Some soldiers began to withdraw, speaking less, observing more, recording everything silently. Their inner lives became a careful balancing act between fear, disbelief, and analysis. Small social interactions intensified the effect. Guards and officers would respond politely to questions, acknowledge requests without condescension, and maintain rules without cruelty. Fellow prisoners sometimes joked quietly or shared stories of life before capture, adding human texture to the environment. None of this fit into the framework the German soldiers had been taught. Their training had conditioned them to see the British as embodiments of hatred. Now, faced with humanity and consistency, their preconceptions were eroding. The prisoners' perception of time changed. Days passed with measured repetition: meals, work, cleaning, inspection, rest. Each cycle reinforced the reality that captivity could exist without suffering. Sleep became restless. Dreams mixed past horrors with present calm. Some soldiers reported difficulty distinguishing between expectation and observation. The human mind, trained to anticipate pain, struggled to process an environment defined by the absence of it. Historical records indicate that this dissonance had long-term effects. Letters smuggled out of camps describe the kind of mental fatigue, a strain not caused by deprivation, but by the effort to reconcile belief with reality. One soldier wrote that he felt imprisoned by the absence of threat, a paradox he could not articulate fully. Diaries from the same period show a gradual erosion of certainty, replaced by a cautious, analytical wariness. It was not contentment. It was a slow, deliberate collapse of a worldview. Even the camp hierarchy, intended to maintain discipline, became a source of reflection. German officers assigned to oversee their men found themselves grappling with the limits of propaganda. Their authority within the prisoner ranks was still recognized, but the certainty of shared beliefs was weakening. Soldiers no longer accepted the narrative of British cruelty unquestioningly. This subtle shift altered interactions, morale, and the mental landscape of the camp. The psychological impact extended beyond individual soldiers. Groups began to behave differently, observing, analyzing, and sometimes cooperating in ways that defied prior expectations. Collective routines were maintained not through fear, but through observation, habit, and the understanding that cruelty was not inevitable. Camps that had been designed for control found themselves hosting minds in quiet, persistent negotiation with reality. As months passed, subtle signs of adaptation appeared. Prisoners learned to perform assigned tasks efficiently, not out of fear of punishment, but because the work was structured and clear. They began to predict schedules, understand patterns, and manage daily life without anxiety over imagined threats. Yet, the mental effort required to achieve this adaptation was profound. They were still prisoners, still captives, still subject to the authority of others. The difference lay in the absence of expected cruelty, which demanded constant cognitive adjustment. Post-war reflections reveal that the experience left lasting impressions. Soldiers recounted how the calm, the order, and the politeness of British captivity created a sense of dislocation that was at times more intense than the front lines. The human brain, accustomed to threat and conditioned to expect malice, had to process a world that consistently refused to conform. For some, this led to disbelief and denial. For others, it prompted careful analysis and reflection on propaganda, ideology, and perception. The experience also sheds light on the broader psychological mechanics of war. Propaganda and indoctrination can shape expectation with great force, but reality, when consistently contradictory, challenges those assumptions. The British camps did not break soldiers through force or intimidation. They created a space in which the prisoners' assumptions about the world were systematically undermined by quiet observation, predictable routines, and humane treatment. The shock was not in what was done to them, but in what was not done. The realization took time. Soldiers slowly recognized that the enemy was capable of order without cruelty, discipline without humiliation, authority without malice. This recognition was destabilizing because it did not fit into the binary worldview taught by Nazi ideology. Enemy soldiers were not monsters, and captivity did not require suffering. The moral and psychological framework the prisoners had carried for years began to fracture under the weight of this simple, persistent truth. By the time the war ended, many of these men carried an understanding of human behavior that contrasted sharply with their prior beliefs. Diaries and memoirs reflect a deep engagement with the nature of perception, authority, and indoctrination. They observe that fear is most potent when it fills every expectation, and that calm, structure, and predictability can be as disorienting as overt violence when it defies deeply held assumptions. In the quiet of the camps, the German soldiers confronted the limits of their own indoctrination. They had arrived expecting punishment and brutality, and instead found routine, decency, and predictability. The psychological shock was profound because it attacked certainty itself. What they believed to be inevitable was in fact absent. What they expected to dominate them instead left them to confront the fragility of expectation. By observing order where they anticipated chaos, politeness where they anticipated malice, and routine where they anticipated terror, these prisoners were forced into a form of mental recalibration. Their worldviews were not destroyed, but they were tested in subtle, relentless ways. In the end, the experience revealed as much about the prisoners' own minds as it did about the nation that held them. The story of German POWs in Britain is not one of suffering in captivity, nor of liberation through conflict. It is a study in expectation versus reality, in the dissonance between indoctrinated fear and empirical observation. It is a testament to the quiet power of human behavior and to the unexpected ways in which calm, order, and restraint can challenge deeply held beliefs. For the soldiers who arrived in Britain expecting a nightmare, the true test was not of body, but of mind. They confronted the absence of what they had been taught to fear, And in that confrontation, they discovered the most difficult lesson of all, that the human experience is not always defined by cruelty, and that certainty itself can be a fragile, fleeting construct. And so, as the last transport trains departed the camps and the war drew to its conclusion, the German prisoners carried with them a memory of captivity unlike any they could have imagined. Not suffering, not punishment, but an unrelenting, quiet challenge to what they believed. A challenge that lingered long after the gates were opened, long after the soldiers returned home, in the form of reflection, disbelief, and the new understanding of the limits of perception and the enduring power of human order.